So there's some caution today for today's show because our discussions might be bringing up some feelings of discomfort, but hopefully it also will bring about some time for reflective thinking. Because what we're going to be talking about today is looking at what are typical school practices, activities, traditions that we have, and how inclusive are they? And not just inclusive for students with disabilities, but inclusive for all kids. And the good news is, with our guest today, we are going to be getting lots of bright ideas. Shine it on Paula. I have to see which way it goes.
I love props.
So if you know Paula, you know that she is just this wonderful person that can capture so much and share all the insight that she has. She works as a consultant, so she's in schools around the country. You've probably heard her as a speaker at a conference. And today we get to have her with us on our show. So I want to welcome both our live viewers and people watching on the replay. If you're new to the show, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a retired teacher, a parent. I do advocacy full-time for families and host this weekly show. So Paula Kluth is with us today, and you may have seen Paula on a previous show. I'll have to put the link in for that when she did a show with us on co-teaching with Julie Costin and showed off some of her unique attire that she wears.
I did wear some boxer shorts on that episode, not to try to tease people back to the episode, but I did. But so today I don't have that, but I'm going to change into, I don't have my Apple sweater and I don't have my Apple boxer shorts, but I do have Apple earrings. So I'm going to change. I'm doing a wardrobe change for the live. It's actually an Apple core. I don't know if you can see it.
All right.
That's as much of a wardrobe change as I could do today because we have a lot to cover. That's why.
I know. We are going to get started. And one of the things that I had posted on my Facebook page was about the coffee cart. And are there some special things in your school more special than they need to be? And this has generated a lot of interest, a lot of conversation. And today, what Paula is going to be talking about are a lot of the ideas are coming from her book, Don't We Already Do Inclusion? And this will be one of Paula's books that we give away today. So make sure you're commenting because we'll be picking a lucky winner towards the end. And I also have another surprise book from Paula that will be a giveaway. So stick around for that. And we just want to be able to encourage you to interact with us and post your comments, say hi, let us know where you're viewing from, but also any thoughts, any aha moments that you have, share those in the comments too. So Paula, how would you like to start us out with, I don't know, I know in your book you talk about a special assessment, but how would you like us to begin our conversation today about, looking at ways to really make sure that we're creating inclusive activities for all students?
Well, Sherman, why don't we start by talking about that one example, the elephant in the room, the coffee cart, because, I'm having my coffee, my Snoopy mug today. I love coffee so much. And one of the things that you said, I love it. And you have that parent, you're that parent mug. I have my copy of the book too. And I have a little passage in here that I want to share. People do already have the book. One of the things that you said to me was that when you were kind of skimming the book and had used the book as a resource, you had missed that there was, that I mentioned this in the book, and it's a very brief mention because it's not its own item. So people that do have the book, it's on page 89, and it's in a section that's called Conduct a Special Assessment. And so I just wanted to point that out because it's not like I'm taking on the coffee cart alone. As Charmaine is saying, like, we're talking about a lot of structures, and we're going to go through some of those, but let's talk about that. Let's take it head on, take a sip out of that coffee mug, because you and I were both seeing this. A lot of people talking about it, people asking our opinions about it. And when I would go places, here's the thing, like when you visit a lot of schools, people want to kind of show off what they're doing, what's new, what they're getting attention for, what's getting sometimes awards, those kinds of things. So it's not just been once, but several times that people have told me about, this is years ago, but they started telling me about their coffee carts. And I say, oh, what's that? And I assumed it was, I used to be in a marketing class, a business ed class when I was in high school. And it was really cool. We had to run the school store. We had to do these cool displays. We learned about, marketing, sales, those kinds of things. I thought maybe it was that when I first heard about it. Come to find out, in most places, it is a structure that is purely staffed by and centered around folks with disabilities. And so that's where I started thinking, a lot of times, the thing that made me go, was that a lot of times these kinds of things, I'm working with all kinds of schools, but a lot of times inclusive schools. And what was really curious to me was how often we saw these kinds of structures inside inclusive schools. So what it really helps us think about is, inclusion isn't just about the curriculum and the instruction, that it's about all of the, all of the structures, the rituals, the norms that we experience, observe, that we, organically plant, that we have to, when we assess, and this is not a formal assessment, but I'm just saying, when you really think about and look around and really take stock of what kinds of opportunities are available for students, we want you to think about, is this particular structure inclusive? And you can just start by looking at the things that kids with disabilities are involved in on your campus and just, think to yourself, are those kinds of experiences inclusive? Charmaine, do you want to talk about what you said right before we went on about one of the things that you think about with that?
Well, one of the things I was sharing with Paula was my son Dylan has Down syndrome. He's an adult. He rents a house with a couple of roommates. He does get staff support from an agency. And one of the, struggles is, even though Dylan had a total inclusive life in school and in college, in the adult world, it's like a whole nother realm trying to explain inclusion to people. And everyone, right, has good intentions. But there was a young man, well, actually not that young, an older gentleman in this same agency that was getting support that never was a Boy Scout and always wanted to be a Boy Scout. So the agency said, this would be a great opportunity. We can make this adult Boy Scout troop and we can have participants join it. And Dylan was like, I was a Boy Scout when I was in middle school and elementary school. I don't want to be a Boy Scout again. And it was like, if that gentleman wanted to be a scout because he wanted to go camping, because he wanted to go hiking or things like that, why don't we look at, what do we have in the community, what meetup groups or whatever for outdoor activities, and get the gentleman involved that way versus choosing to make this separate activity just for people with disabilities. So it's just, our mind seems like it always goes to look, oh, we don't have that. Let's create that as this separate thing. But we probably do have a lot of resources in our communities and our schools that we can really tap into.
It's so true. And I love how you talked about that, because you said it doesn't end at school. This goes on forever, which I think is really important to think about. And when there is a need for a person with a disability, so often there's a need for other people. So and oftentimes it does exist. And what made me think about when you were talking was, and if it doesn't exist, could we create something that all would be welcome to sort of be involved in? So to take it back to our cart, when I first started talking to people about this, they would go, wait a second. I mean, I had a teacher say to me, I love her. I love her coffee cart. She wasn't even involved in it. She was a special ed teacher, but she goes, I'm not getting my coffee. And I said, listen, I'm not trying to take anyone's coffee away. Ever, ever, ever. I love it. But we want to just create those same opportunities. So here's the irony of the coffee cart for me. At the same time that I was seeing Facebook posts and all kinds of conversations and newspaper articles and things like that about coffee carts, special coffee carts, we are also starting to see, because of the Starbucks explosion and us all paying, well, you live out there, Charmaine, you pay $1 million for a cup of coffee. This is a real, entrepreneurial centerpiece in a lot of communities, right? So now you're seeing certain high schools who are actually putting, real coffee houses in their schools and teaching kids. Now I'm talking about coffee carts. I'm talking about really teaching kids how to be baristas and do this work. So here we have, on one hand, us doing these separate carts. On the other hand, this enthusiasm for really doing something cool and teaching kids about marketing and how to be baristas, which is not a simple thing. Teaching people how to use this sort of complicated, it's almost like, it's like being a chef. There's all kinds of things to learn. You're learning about the plans to create the space itself. And so what a wonderful opportunity to take it from wherever it is and make it not only inclusive, but to include literally hundreds of skills and competencies, to include business education, mathematics, to include the community itself in this. It could really be something fantastic. And it doesn't mean that if you just had that lone coffee cart and you've got just kids with disabilities, now you have to make a Starbucks. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, isn't it interesting that these conversations are really coming together, and we should be using that energy to start thinking about how to make something inclusive. It could be as simple as saying, hey, why not kids with and without disabilities? And then what other skills can we bring in? Because we don't want to bring in, here's 8 kids with disabilities and bring in 2 non-disabled peers who kind of help them. That's not what we're talking about either. We're saying, as you brought up earlier, natural proportions. What would natural proportions look like? And we're talking about authentic roles. So you may be doing this piece. I'm actually going to work on signage and some other marketing stuff. What are you doing and what would you like to learn? And so we create something really sophisticated and cool that kids want to be a part of. So we're not only are we not getting rid of it, we may be adding pastries and more. So that's already there, lots of play. But you know what I'm saying? What is the foods class doing? So in none of these instances, we're not saying get rid of these structures. We're saying make them inclusive.
Right. And it would be interesting. We have a lot of people on with us live. I would love to know, do you know in your, schools, are there coffee carts, and what do they look like? And what ideas might you have, or questions that you want to ask Paula about how to tweak that structure so it is more inclusive? So yeah, let us know in the comments, and we will keep track of if you've got questions. So Angela is with us, and Angela says she's responding to Kimberly. And she says, yes, Kimberly, it's going to have to take a whole huge paradigm shift in the way people think for that to occur. It's slowly happening. Because Kimberly had said, if we are truly inclusive, we shouldn't have to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, that's right. What sometimes we look for is, wouldn't it be nice if we don't have to have these shows about how to be inclusive, that it no longer is something that we have to really, think about and reflect on and act on, but it's something that is naturally occurring. And Paula works with a lot of schools that, are inclusive and do have, supports brought to students in classrooms. But also we know that there's work that we still have to do, and that's okay. But, Paula, I don't know if you want to look a little bit more on your special assessment, like what other traditions or norms do you see in some schools that could use some?
Do I ever? I got a Santa Claus list over here. Okay. So one thing that I want to say is about that paradigm shift is what's really cool is, sometimes I was talking with a group this morning, we were saying you don't know what you don't know sometimes. So once you've established something that's truly inclusive, then you can point to that. And folks might say, oh, I never thought of doing it that way. And you see how at the coffee cart, we don't just have, it's not just for kids with disabilities. It's not just, we try to make it accessible and welcoming for all. And now folks go, oh yeah, we could do that with this, this, and this. That extracurricular could be done that way or so on. So I like that it starts to give people a template for having a bigger conversation. So a couple of the others that I wrote about, but ever so briefly. And in the video that you mentioned, the coffee cart video, if you stay tuned long enough when I keep ranting, you'll also see that I talk about lunch tables and prom. So I want to talk about both of those. Let's talk about the lunch table first. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of schools, and I know all this stuff can be really tough and needs a lot of planning, but the lunch situation is what we see a lot. We might see something like a lunch buddies or kids assigned to be having lunch with each other, something like that. And so I wanted to kind of make a point that should be part of our assessment. Anytime we look at how people are spending their time or what activities they're involved in, we need to ask a question like, first of all, is that too special? And the reverse of that, is that really inclusive? And you brought up earlier, Charmaine, is it natural proportions? And so that's one way of thinking about it. Is it age appropriate is something else to think about. Is it a valued activity? Those are some of the things to consider. Are other kids involved in this? And so one of the things about lunch is I noticed that they'll have maybe some kids with disabilities together, and then they'll assign kids to come over and maybe rotate to eat there. So I was in a school and they would have like 3 kids from, I don't know if it was from student council or what have you, but they would come through and then they would eat with the kids with disabilities. And so primarily that was a table of kids with disabilities with some visitors. And again, we completely understand, as we say, that the intention of saying, hey, we really want kids to support each other and things like that. But to make this something that would be more typical of a natural high school experience, we would be thinking about flipping that. And so, there's lots of different ways that this can look. One of the resources, this is not addressing the entire issue, but one of my favorite resources that I reference in the book is Mix It Up Day, which is something that's kind of been promoted by Teaching Tolerance. So I think that's just tolerance.org, and you can do a Google search for Mix It Up. And that's just a way that kids, I think once or twice a year, that high schools are getting involved, and they have kids sort of getting mixed up at different tables. Sometimes there's prompts at the table so kids can talk to each other. Different cliques get to talk to each other, different groups. But I said, in that spirit of Mix It Up, we want to think about things like, how do we maybe what would it look like to have a lunchroom that's inclusive where kids get to eat, they kind of have some choices and that they're meeting different kids. So I saw kind of the reverse of the program I talked about, I think on television. And it was a student council president who was really a go-getter. And he talked a lot about inclusivity broadly, what I call capital I. So all kids that don't feel like they have a space. And he talked about how sometimes, kids are newcomers. They don't feel like they have anywhere to eat at lunch, and how demoralizing that can be. So the student council started setting up these tables in the lunchroom and essentially said, look, we eat at these lunch tables. And then they encouraged other people to sort of join that bank of tables. And these were sort of known as spaces that anyone hang out, come and hang out. People are talking. People are, it's like there are spaces where people aren't necessarily doing, their own thing, head down in the phone. Like, this is a space where kids want to make connections. And so I think of it like, maybe the modern, you have dropouts or hangouts for, now we kind of find our interest groups in a big city. You can go to the hangout at this coffee house where they're going to have this conversation about nonfiction, or you can go to this hangout where they all like to talk in Russian. There's these different ways of getting to know people. And so they basically said, look, this is a social space for kids to connect. And so opened up this whole space in the cafeteria. So I don't know if that's a perfect solution, but I think it's an interesting way of thinking about all kinds of kids wanting to make connections, and just saying, we know this is an issue in our school. We want everyone to feel welcome. So I don't, again, there's not one recommendation we have for any of this, but just really looking at some of these and saying, how would that look? And one of the things, whether or not you take that recommendation, one of the things I love as a strategy, especially for high school, but not necessarily exclusively for high school, is take it to the kids. Take it to the student council. And, and just say, what? We noticed that there's a lot of kids in our school that they're not making connections with other kids, and we don't know what to do about that. kids, throw these solutions out and talk to them about, what kinds of things are, are challenges, and see what the kids can come up with as a way to make the space itself feel equitable for all. Can we talk about prom with that too?
Yes, and I even have a little slide that I have because this is, what I hear a lot too is, well, but they make this such a wonderful experience for our kids. And so it pulls at your heartstrings. Like, why would you want to not offer this opportunity?
Yeah.
But again, it's that more special than we really need.
Yeah, and I think, here's the thing that really gets me when I hear that. I heard that at a school where I wanted, they had a lunch buddies program, and they were trying to they would bring kids with disabilities, very similar to the other program I talked about, where kids without disabilities would come and eat with kids with disabilities. But this was actually in a special ed room. They didn't even make it to the classroom, to the cafeteria. So I just was kind of stuttering and stammering like this. Why would we limit this to, I think it was Thursdays and Fridays, and was objected to that and wanted to talk through it. And somebody said to me, really passionately, you have no idea how excited the kids are when they have their buddies show up. And I thought, I can imagine how excited they are. And why not have this excitement continue on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Why just Thursday and Friday? And why in that space? In other words, we're not trying to take anybody's connection away. We want people to have an unforgettable experience at prom. We just don't want it to have to be separate from everybody else, because, we're hoping that everybody's planning a really unforgettable experience at prom for all kids. Right. So that should be the underlying question, is why can't this happen elsewhere? What is so different about this particular experience? I think we have to give all kids more credit than that all kids wouldn't want to encourage. And I think sometimes we don't go to the kids enough, so we don't know.
And I think that's excellent, because I think, for IEP meetings and things like that, inviting kids to, friends of your child to go to the IEP meeting and empower those other students to participate and give ideas is like an excellent way to get student voices in the room. And I know, going back to the lunchroom for a minute here, Tracy had said, but what about when the lunchroom is so loud? And, you hear, well, kids with disabilities tend to sit off to the side, partly because that's always how we've done it, but also because it's too loud. So she asked, what suggestions do you have for making the lunchroom more tolerable for kids with sensory issues? Even kids that don't have sensory issues are still struggling with the noise.
Hi, Tracy. I know Tracy, she's wonderful. So great question. And I think that's a really good question to kind of bring us all the way back to, well, what Tracy just did was actually going right to the barrier. So what would be the potential barrier? And so one of the things that I think about with that is, so often when I'm not answering Tracy's question just yet, but one of the things that I know Tracy would agree with me on this is, so often when we do something that's segregated, they'll say, well, we had to do it because it was so distracting before. Yet we've got a kid with disabilities sitting with all these other kids with disabilities, often who also have sensory sensitivity, and with kids who also have sometimes, I work a lot with folks on the spectrum, and they may have, voices that are, sometimes hard to control, volume, rate, speed, all that kind of stuff, may have repetitive patterns and things that can be hard for those sitting next to them. So it's always interesting that, that doesn't come up in other contexts. But back to Tracy's issue is, sometimes there's a real problem to solve here. So first to look at, if that is a pervasive issue for lots of kids, what are the options in our school for other kids? So sometimes I was working in a school, actually one of the first schools I ever worked in, and there was a carpeted area right outside the gym when you went into the lunchroom was the gym, lots of places like that. And then we had sort of this area right outside. So it didn't actually last, because the kid that I thought would have sensory needs didn't ended up wanting to go in. But the very first thing was we ended up setting up a couple tables outside the gym so that just kids could kind of sign up for the quieter lunch space. The carpet sort of absorbed the noise. And so we just thought that would be, a lot of kids would choose it just because of novelty. And they did. A lot of kids did want to do it. And so we could, if that is a pervasive issue, figuring out who would be those kids. Of course, sometimes kids can have full conversations. They can have headphones on. I was talking this morning about universal design. And so some of those options might be made available to any kid. I know adults that in airports and certain busy environments, they always have headphones on. That's just, again, it's lifelong learners. Just we're teaching people how to be in the real world, right? So I love the question and I love the challenge of, in our school, what, and it might be more than just auditory stuff. It might be the smell of the, lunchroom or something like that. So if we're seeing that, it's often more than one person. And again, bringing it to the kids to say, if we could have a small group of folks do this, how do we then make sure that, we get a natural proportion split for kids that want to do something else? This comes up a lot, actually, Tracy, with, and you might have seen this with kids who need to stay inside for recess for one reason or another. And then we're saying, well, instead of a couple of kids staying in because these two kids have cerebral palsy and they can't be outside, how can we create some extracurricular options for kids to be in Lego club or for them to be in film club or whatever? And so rotate that so enough kids get those choices. And what we often find is we get more kids than we need to take on those options. And we find out that there is more diversity. Like you said, Tracy, there's more diversity than we originally assumed. Other kids say, you know what? I would rather be doing some of these other things, or I'll do something active, but I'd rather do it inside for whatever reason. So I think taking it back to Tracy's kind of question and say, what is the barrier for, whether it's coffee cart or lunchroom or prom or whatever it is, let's address the barrier itself instead of assuming that it has to stay separate.
Yeah, and I love your idea about bringing in other students, or, if there's a student council proposing it there, because my guess is if somebody facilitated that conversation, there would be more than the loud noise. Like you said, the smells, for some kids, that's a real trigger. There are other things that even as adults, we don't think about. And
that's UDL. I mean, that's part of UDL is saying, right, if that indeed is an issue, and it's a very good one, Tracy, that Tracy brought up, it's probably in play, as you said, for a lot of kids. And so in our this newer commitment to what we're called universal design, which we know is not just about curriculum and instruction, we need to start to ask, well, what do we do for adults? Because a lot of adults have these needs, and how do we make that happen? Can we do it perfectly the way we want to do it? Probably not. But what are some concessions we could make, and what are some interesting changes that we could put on the table?
Right.
No pun intended. But I want that big one out.
Well, and Jennifer brings up a point that I think a lot of people think about, because what she feels is that frustration of kids not being properly supported in regular, programs, or there's not enough, professional support, or friends take off and leave the students. And I don't know if you have any tips or reassurance of how we can make sure that our kids really are being supported, and that it's not just, physically putting a child into a general-ed classroom and calling it inclusion. So if you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, what I love about the question is that everyone's taking it back to the specific barriers, which I think is super important. And I love to see that, because if we just say, well, I prefer it this way, or yeah, let's jump on board and do that, without saying, well, there's a lot of hurdles we'll have to get over. Yeah, there probably are. So when we look at all the scaffolds that go into a special prom or to special lunch or whatever it is, we may have to bring some of those supports over or have the same kinds of conversations, right? So for instance, when I think about, involving peers in special prom, I mean, that took the cultivation of group of people, having really being thoughtful about the food that's served, making sure it's safe, what kinds of music's played, that there's no strobe lights. I mean, all those kinds of things that you would have to do. Could we make that happen in some way, shape, or form, or in many ways as possible in our prom? So what Charmaine and I were saying earlier was, the thing about prom is it's a very provocative and interesting example, because prom is inaccessible to a lot of people. When you ask people, like, it's kind of almost a point of pride for some people, like, oh, I didn't go to my prom, and I didn't, and so why is that a point of pride? It's like, oh my gosh, those people, that was not for me, kind of thing. So I was saying, I always have to pause here, LGBTQ, to get all that in our community. For a lot of kids, they don't feel welcome at prom. Financially, kids may feel, I've seen at schools where the tickets are $50. I mean, for a lot of kids, that's cost prohibitive. So those are all barriers. I'm not saying they're equal barriers. Some of them are bigger than others. But if we are really committed to this language of UDL, the concept of inclusion, that means everybody. That means we have to look beyond disability and into disability. So does that mean, in a lot of places I go to conferences, Peak, which we're going to plug later, Peak Parent Center, having their big conference, they have karaoke night, all these kinds of things. National Down Syndrome, they always have their events have these really cool dances for everybody. And what the value is always put upon is inclusivity. So if you need a quiet room, there's a quiet room nearby, that there's people, standing by to support, that there's some dances that are crafted so that there's a way to participate that's really obvious, so I could go on and on. Is it easy to do? No, it's not. You can't drop the kid off at the prom and say that's it. This will have to be thoughtfully planned, just like a special prom is thoughtfully planned. A lot of time goes into that. Can we put the same time in and make sure that we're not so insular, that we're thinking just about those kinds of needs, but how could we really make this that unforgettable night? I would hate to think that every one of those groups that we're underserving would need to have their own space. Is there a way to make this community building event really fantastic for all kids? No way do I think this is easy. I just think it's such an important conversation to have, because sometimes when we give somebody something, and I talk a lot about this in my presentations, sometimes when we give somebody something and something special to have, we're taking something away too. And it's because we're giving something, it's not as obvious what we're taking away, which might be this time and experience, in my community. It could be connections with others that I haven't had an opportunity to sort of choose my own acquaintances and connections and things like that. So we want to really be thoughtful about those kinds of things. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this is KIT. Another resource is KIT, Kids Included Together. Some of you may know about KIT. They have some materials about prom on their website. It's just kit.org. And they offer, I think, some virtual training. They offer in-house training. I don't know if that's just for, I think, depending on your resources. But there are a lot in the West Coast. But KIT has done a lot with this work that's extracurricular. So that would be a resource to look at, especially around prom, because I know that that was something that my friend Stephen Hinkle, who's a guy on the spectrum and is an academic, he's done some work on this. And I know that Tori Dunlop from KIT has done a lot of thinking about this as well. So those might be places to look for more content.
And Dinah's with us, and I love Dinah because she always pushes my thinking. So she says, I'm struggling a little bit with more special than it needs to be, because isn't the availability of something like UDL grounded in more special for all, but with choice and with self-direction? So more than addressing barriers, because this assumes that the thing that has those barriers around it is somehow what's working and good for students, I'm trying to think whether it's about meaningfully addressing what's going on in general ed and whether that works for anyone, really. This is a left field comment.
I don't think it's left field. I think it's great. I love it. It's sort of this, I almost think about, chaos theory. Sometimes everything has to fall down before you can build up something stronger. It's a great comment, actually, is to think about, is that the best way to have that, celebration? Is it a series of kinds of celebrations? I mean, you bring up a wonderful point, and I love it. I don't know, I don't have a specific response to it, which is odd because I talk all the time, but I love the idea of the first thing being, let's just really critique this and think about, is something organically a better idea? That's really great.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when we hear so much about inclusive education, that we think that that only means our kids are in general ed classes or participating in extracurricular activities. And if they ever have to leave the general ed classroom, that's a no-no. That's not going to be inclusive ed. And I guess what I've tried to think about is how do we have other spaces in the building that are available for anybody, right? So if you need a quiet space to work, you don't necessarily have to go to the special ed room, but maybe the library or the media center is a good place for you to go to do your work. If you need some additional help and explanation, can that resource room be a true resource room for all students versus no, you just have to have an IEP before you can enter here. Correct. So I think looking at all our school environments and how we can make them, be supportive for students. And it doesn't have to always be in that general ed room, but we don't want it to be in a segregated place where that's the only, you have to have this ticket to get in there.
Only kids with disabilities interact and learn. You hit it on the head, which is why I love you. And two things that come to mind for that are we're headed in that direction. And to go back to universal design, I was in a school in the area here, which is designed, universally designed. It's a very, a very nice area of town. It's all like LEED certified, it's beautiful. And what struck me in touring this gorgeous facility, there's natural light everywhere. There's all these different workspaces. There's glass in the back of the classrooms, and that leads out so you can see kids that are working outside in the hallway. When you come into the hallway, there's almost a living room, and then there's separate spaces kids can work on projects. You get the idea. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, we've been right all along. That inclusion has oftentimes, the idea that we have is the right idea, but we're often encumbered by architecture itself. And not just physical architecture, but the architecture of lesson design. So you're absolutely right. I think we're getting there, probably, not before I'm out of the field where it looks this way everywhere. But when I think about what Google looks like and ball pits and sit where you want and do independent work here with kids doing, all kinds of, we have Innovation Day, we have kids doing some of their own work on their, I think the schools of the future will look very different. And so we have to sort of create it in the way that you're talking about before we even have the space ready to go, which is an interesting challenge, right? But you're absolutely right. It's not that this isn't kind of back to that organic comment. It's like we need to start from the ground up and say, what does good learning look like for everybody? It doesn't mean maybe that one space, but how do we create schools where there's all kinds of ways to learn? And in fact, one of the other ideas in the book, as I talk about, this is a little snarky, but it says, if you're doing reverse inclusion, you're going in reverse. It's kind of snarky, but what it means is some people will say, oh, we have a special ed room, but we bring, we bring the kids in. And we have kids without disabilities that come in for parts of the day. So it's reverse inclusion. And so I talk about what you're talking about, which is it's still the proportions are off. That's not inclusion, that kind of thing. And that in fact, what we should be thinking about instead is creating spaces with if we've only got one school, so we only have 2 kids with disabilities in there. And I said, well, why not make that a learning space where you can be a little noisy if you need to be, but anybody can bring projects there. Anybody can do that kind of work. In another high school, they did sort of more of an area that was almost a coffee area. You could have your coffee, you could study in the morning, but when kids were getting ready to go off to do different things and getting their schedules ready, other kids were in there having a coffee and a study session. So you're exactly right, hitting it on the head. It's like, let's re-envision what this can look like. Before we get to the other stuff, can I just say, I just made a 2-minute laundry list of some of the other, how do we say this? Some of the other offenders. Okay. I wanted to say this because some of them will be self-explanatory, but things that people tell me about that are not jobs in general in school. Like I believe every kid can have jobs, but when it's only kids with disabilities, that's not inclusive, right? All kids need to learn job skills and things like that. Daddy-daughter dances, those kinds of constellations, muffins with mom. These are not just about disability, but there's so many kids that is a wound. It's not, an inclusive way to be. So then we want to think of capital I inclusion, not just disability, but beyond. Is this inclusive? Can we have can we have just, you can use alliteration, but I mean, think about ways that all of us, our community comes together, community coffee or whatever it is. It's not as cute, I know, but let's really think about our language. Mother wrote me on Twitter and said, and a really great advocate mom, she said, can you please post something about Twins Day? Schools will have these ritual days where it's like, today's pajama day, today's Twins Day. My child, basically, she didn't say, but like, is it excluded? And some kids get to do it and some don't. To be honest, until she had said that in the way she said it, I had always thought about it in other ways, but like inclusion, much broader, thought about it as, more micro, but really great point about are there other celebrations we can have. Another one is that comes up a lot is at schools is holiday stuff. Certain kinds of. One mom said to me, my kid didn't get to go to the certain event, and because they had all the kids with disabilities go and they all met Santa and Mrs. Santa came around. And I said, I'd be super concerned about your child missing out on the general ed experience he was supposed to have. And I'd be just as concerned that is a clear, church and state kind of separation issue. I mean, you can say it's secular, but you get the idea. That what is, are we really creating schools that are centered in this idea of being welcoming? It is a constant struggle for me to think about what it means to be welcoming and inclusive. It never ends because it's ever changing. But those kinds of things, should, as you said, we should be having this allies and having conversations about all kinds of things that don't feel quite warm and welcoming to all. They don't feel like the spot. They don't feel like a place for families or kids themselves. And the other one was that I was at a school tangential to that. I was at a school where they were all giving money. The kids were elementary school were being asked to bring in money for to buy things for a big Christmas basket, holiday basket for a family in need. And without saying much more about it, for sensitivity reasons, I was well aware that there were kids in that school that fell into that category of being in need. And if you brought $1 in or $2, you actually got a reward for it. You got a pencil or you got something. So there's all these weird inequities. And again, backing it all the way up to think about, is that inclusive? What does that feel like? And to say nothing of the literature on what true giving feels like to kids and what does it really mean to help kids feel to engage in something that's altruistic and truly giving. And most kids bringing in $1 or $2 is going to do very little to help them connect to their community. Right. So I just wanted to broaden that out a little bit.
And Courtney also brought up best buddies, which is another big thing that we see. And so many times I think parents and teachers see it as this is a wonderful opportunity. And instead, what I've seen, I don't know, I think what worries me is that it comes from this place of pity or, I feel sorry, they don't have friends. I would love to go, spend some time with them. But as far as being true reciprocal friendship relationships, I'm not sure that always happens with a Best Buddies program.
Yeah, and it's kind of what I love about what you said earlier, and it was kind of when we were off camera, but you talked about, again, the college experience and saying, you didn't have a program. You just went in there and sort of did it. That's not always easy, especially like what Tracy or people that are parents to go in there and do something new. But from the teachers that are listening and those that are in the inside to say, do we need a program for what we want to do? In other words, you might want to take it to the kids and say, hey, what does this look like? What are kids getting out of these experiences? And so is it service that we want to do together? Do we want to have like a club where kids are just involved in, my kids at a high school that's so huge, they have a club for everything. They have a friendship bracelet making club. I'm not making that up. They have a coloring book club. I mean, they have everything. So like they want kids to just kind of like, chill and connect kind of thing. What are the activities you're going to do? Is it a sports club? Is it a recreational club? So what are the things that Best Buddies would do? And then instead of making it framed around the partnerships, just say, okay, we want all kids to be in this. But what's the focus is going to be? We're going to do service, or this is going to be a focus for like hanging out or doing good works or whatever it is. So bring it so that we do really have the centerpiece that really being, authentic relationship building. It's not easy because, as you and I have both said, when there's a structure and a name and marketing and all that stuff around it, it's easier for individuals to know sort of what to do and how to proceed in a sense. But I also think that there's some barriers in place themselves because we end up communicating maybe a different set of values than we would like to have at the center of those kinds of events and rituals.
Right. And Susan has a comment. She says that my autistic daughter is giving up and wanting to homeschool. Our options feel so limited. The public school would not give her access to general ed until we filed a state complaint. The private school we've been at says as long as a parent hires the aide and the student can conform with their program, they can stay. Are there places that actually make students feel welcome and valued members of the community?
I mean, I think I want to have you speak to it also, Charmaine, but I think it's one of the most heartbreaking questions I can get doing the work is saying, well, I'm not a teacher. I'm not somebody that can sort of be in control of this and run these programs. And another version of that question is, should I just sort of give into the program that they want my child to have, or do I hold out for inclusion, knowing that how hard they're making it on me? And so, I always talk about, that even though it is, we don't have nearly what we need to have almost anywhere, that things are getting slowly better. It's not always quickly enough for your own child. So that's that's the hard part of that. But looking at what I think a lot of families are doing is kind of looking at their communities and trying to coalesce with other folks that want what they want and saying, one person on their own, it's so hard to do it. If there are other people that you can involve to say there's, near here, I know there's a very, very strong group of parents that have gotten together in a local high school. And when there was one or two of them, there wasn't much happening. But when they were able to coalesce a little bit, it has actually started to make a dent in quite an impressive way. And that's not the only thing that may be helpful. But I do think there are some of these places, there are not nearly enough of them. And that's, why I'm so grateful that you're doing what you're doing, especially on the parent side, Charmaine, because these are not easy questions and nor answers.
Right. And it is. And it's heartbreaking because it's like your kid doesn't have years to wait for things to change, right?
Right.
I mean, every moment, every day is critically important for your child's learning. And so it is such a individual decision that you have to make as a family. And I think, what Paula was speaking about as far as, I call it kind of widening our circle of allies. We can't continue, I think, to make enough change with just parents of children with disabilities. We are seen as a special interest group. We are not given the credibility. We have to be looking at this from a broader picture. And that's why I love Universal Design for Learning so much. And we have to look and talk with other parents and not have that special PTA, but join your regular PTA or PTO and show the commitment that you have to public education and wanting to make improvements, not only for your child, but for all kids. And I think when we start broadening that, our subject is about all students, which we've used a lot, but a lot of times that's been in the context of kids with disabilities. But there are, I'm sure, so many other families in your neighborhood school that don't feel connected, that don't feel like their child is getting what they need. And those voices have to be brought in too, in order to make those bigger changes. But I think for the day-to-day, like, what do I do now? I mean, how, prohibitive is it for a parent to be able to financially support hiring their own child's aide in order to be accepted at a private school? but yeah, it comes down to a decision that as a family you have to make, because you know your child best and you know what your specific situation is. But it's certainly a heartbreak that a lot of families feel when the school is rejecting noticing the gifts and the strengths that their child has and how to build on them, and instead is focusing on how wide the gap is or what your child can't do. So that changing that mindset is a slow process, but one that's really necessary and required, right?
That's right. And, and very quickly, I think and not that these are magic in any way, but I think 3 quick things that I tell everybody are, if, the one thing is to always go in with really a very specific idea of what you want, because sometimes I think that puts people on their heels in a good way. It's saying, oh, I didn't know, I was working with a parent and I said, outline the high school schedule for them, because they don't know what this would look like for a kid with Down syndrome. So if you say hour by hour, this is exactly what I'm thinking about, instead of them being overwhelmed and saying, oh, I don't know what that would look like, you're saying, I do, here's what it would look like. Exactly what I want. And it's not been helpful every time, but it's been helpful sometimes. The other thing is to think about, obviously, potentially, like you said, leadership and not just involving the PTA, but sometimes even getting involved in those organizations. You and I know more than one parent who's really successfully been involved on the school board to these ends and making some changes that way. And I actually have more than one close friend who's been the president of the school board and has made a lot of inroads. That's not for everybody. And then, also just be aware of like Charmaine and other wonderful advocates that work with parents, because sometimes you do need that sounding board and you do need to work more closely with somebody who has a lot of experience with these conversations.
Right. And, I so appreciate your time, and I want to make sure that we also have a couple moments to talk about Peak Parents Years Inclusive Education Conference coming up February 20th and 21st. Some of our viewers might have seen my conversation with Barbara Buswell, the director for Peak, a few days ago. I'm bummed because I'm going to be going there this year and Paula's not going to be there.
I don't want to promote this conference because it's a super fun conference and everyone that's going there is amazing. My former boss and colleague, Patrick Schwartz, Jonathan Mooney's going, Michael McSheehan, Charmaine, Barb is going to be there, obviously, my favorite people in the world. So what a powerhouse. Always walk the walk, talk the talk. Folks with disabilities always presenting alongside allies, and fun and very joyful experience.
Yes. So this is the link, and I'll also put it in the post. And just a heads up, you can get the early bird registration cost if you register by January 17th. I told Paula that this year my son Dylan and I are presenting a session on, I think we're calling it like DIY, what is it? Do it yourself.
DIY.
Inclusive college, because sometimes you just have to make it, right? If it doesn't exist, you just kind of plug away. And so Dylan will be sharing his story about how he did that at the University of Colorado. I'm also going to be doing a session about using the IEP to make sure that your child has that inclusive education, and looking at each section in the IEP on how we can embed inclusion and not just waiting to the end of the meeting when we talk about placement. So I'm excited because I'll be seeing lots of friends, except for Paula this year.
Well, we'll never do it again without each other.
But Paula, you're going to be in, is it Spokane in April? Talking, I think the ARC out there in Washington is having you come back as a speaker.
I don't have the details on the top of my head, but that sounds right.
So I'll look that up and I'll put that, because it's like about 8 hours from where I am, and I don't know. But I thought I'm going to drive up to see Paula. So I'll also.
And it's a great group too. Yeah, that's a great group. I don't have the front of my head, but yeah, great group, and should be a great event.
Right. So thank you so much, Paula, for being here. Before we close, though, we got to remember, I'm going to pick somebody to win your Don't We Already Do inclusion. So the way I do this is a high tech way of picking a winner. I close my eyes and I scroll through the comments, and whoever I stop on is the lucky winner. So buckle your seatbelts. I'm going to close my eyes and scroll through the comments. And look here, we have Karen. Karen's from Colorado. Woo-hoo. Karen, you just won a copy of Paula's book. So send me your mailing address, Karen, in a private message. How exciting. And Karen has a young son, and she is just like a mover and a shaker. So I am so excited that she'll get your book. And then the second book that we have to give away is my surprise. And so, Paula, if you want a little bit about your new book that you've written, Coaster.
Oh my gosh, this is a passion project. It's 5 years in the making. I'm not even kidding. But it's a little bit of a kind of a surprise ending. And it's about a little doggy with some wheels, and they're fabulous. And all the dogs are just really jealous. Let's face it, they're jealous. He's the best one, but he can't quite figure out why he's not the first one to find a home, even though he's so dazzling. And so the story was sort of about he's like thinking of his perfect person. Will he find his perfect person? So that's little Coaster has been in my brain for 5 years. He was just born in December. He's just a puppy.
Yes. So we'll do the other high-tech giveaway here where I close my eyes.
I love that.
And we will see. We need a drum roll. Paula, can you make drum roll? There you go. Oh, and look, Dinah won it. Oh, so cool. So, Dinah, I don't think I have your mailing address. So if you want to post that in a private comment. And also, I want to make sure for you guys, if you want to get the show notes from today's show and also some additional resources that Paula recommends, just type the phrase inclusive schools in the comments. And hopefully my IEP bot is awake and working this afternoon, and we'll get back with you so we can get you set up for that. But Paula, you are always such a wonderful person. I'm a little disappointed though, because I didn't see, besides your Apple like earrings, I mean, where are the props?
You know what? Okay, just to take that challenge for a second, I'm going to step away and show you that I at least at my desk have a whale. I just give him the whale that my child made me. So if Patrick Schwartz does see this, he will know I did at least have one prop. And it's
yes, and that's another great book of Paula's, right?
Thank
you so much. You are always such, I don't know, like an engaging real life person to sit down and talk to. And you have so much insight because of all the schools that you've worked in, because of the roles that you've played, you know, being a teacher and being a consultant and a speaker and an advocate. So it's just so warm to know that, you know, people like you are out there every day making changes. And we just so appreciate your time with us today.
Right back at you. Mutual Admiration Society meeting adjourned.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Again, we know this isn't easy. We just want to have that conversation and see if we can't do better.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for watching. If you're on live or the replay, we will be back next Thursday at noon Mountain Time. That will be just an open Q&A time, because I think it's really helpful that you just bring your questions. And so you'll have that opportunity next week. And until then, everybody keep on keeping on, and we will make some wonderful changes together. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Charmaine. Bye.
Bye.